I think people misunderstand bands and chains a lot, that, it's just overload work, that you're overloading the lockout. And you can certainly do that. It's definitely not as straightforward as people think. To give you an example, lots of times what will happen, imagine that you're bench pressing and that you decide that you determine that you have weak triceps and that you want to work more on your bench lockout, so you throw some chains on. You'll have to reduce the bar weight in order to get the chain on there and be able to complete reps. And what ends up happening is that it ends up being about the same at the lockout, it's just less on the chest. So does it provide a additional tricep stimulus? Debatable, but it's certainly a lower stimulus off the bottom. That can definitely happen. There's other benefits that are not so much about overloading. In particular, bar path can be useful. And I like to use bands if we're working on bar path for a bench press. And it's not so much about the bands needing to pull you one direction or another. It's not that so much. It's not a proprioceptive thing in the way that the bands are pulling the weight. It's proprioceptive in that the weight is getting heavier as you go toward lockout, and that if you're out of position, that's going to be a problem. So it rewards you by staying in position, that it helps to reinforce a correct bar path. Especially true in the bench press. If you're working with submax weights, you can get by with a pretty sloppy bar path, but it will come back and get you when those weights get heavy. So I do like to use bands in that way. And depending on what you're doing, that the difference between loading off the bottom and loading at the lockout, you need to pay attention to detail and figure out if that's giving you the stimulus that you want, or like I mentioned earlier, it could be reducing a desired stimulus as well. So it's worth paying attention to. You can definitely use bands or chains to get used to heavier weights at the lockout. That's especially useful for equipped lifters, but raw lifters shouldn't overlook it. There's somewhat of a bias against stuff like this. Like, I think most of us want to get stronger for mechanistic reasons. Like, we want to produce more force is the thing that we want to do. And fair enough, me too. But adding weight to the bar is adding weight to the bar. And from a competitive standpoint, it makes you better at the sport. And if you add that weight to the bar because you're a little bit more accustomed to it, or you're able to get just a little bit more air, or you're able to brace a little bit harder or something like that, well, that's still adding weight to the bar, and it can make the difference between a PR and not. Yeah, you hear people talk about using bands and chains or using heavy walkouts or something like that to help confidence. And I think lots of us can dismiss things like that. But again, if it adds weight to the bar, then it adds weight to the bar. And if it's because you're more comfortable, you're more confident, you're able to attack the descent a little bit better because of this confidence, then that's still an improvement, even if it's not necessarily for mechanistic reasons. People lots of times will use way too much when it comes to bands and chains. The rule of thumb that I like to use is 10 to 15% of your 1RM. If you put that on the bar, then most of the emphasis is still on the straight weight aspect of it, and I think that's good. If that is very effective for you, then you can dabble, experiment with using more accommodating resistance, but I've really found that to be a useful heuristic.